Carnegie Public Library, Wednesday, October 27th, 1976, interviewing Dr. N.A. Turner at his home, 118 Von Brook Drive, Wabash, Indiana. The first question I'm going to ask is, tell me about where you were born, your mother and father, and just continue on that thing. I'll hold the mic.
All right. Well, I was born in Grand Junction, Colorado, and I believe my sister was born in Grand Junction, Colorado. The basic reason was my father lived on this cattle ranch and had this ranch in Utah, but the Mormons just like Masons, and the Masons just like Mormons so badly that actually my father moved the family into Colorado so they would be raised not in Utah, where they would be in a prejudiced community. So he would stay at the ranch and come in on trips to visit the family through the school year. Then we'd spend each summer out on the ranch. And he would be in, as I recall, on Christmas. When the Depression hit, basically, that's when we moved into the ranch in Utah and had to, either we lost or sold our house in town. Mm-hmm. And of course, my father had been dead a number of years before that.
Well, let's go back. How did the family get to Utah?
Okay,
so forth?
all right.
Talk about grandma.
Okay, all right. Well, now my grandmother was basically the storyteller, and she apparently her family came from, I recall her referring to Shenandoah, Iowa. Mm-hmm. And they left Iowa in covered wagons in the rush of 59. There was a gold rush in 49, but there's another exodus in 59, and she and apparently a wagon train left there. I recall her telling me about the Indians stealing their horses, and the men, of course, the wagon train had to stop when they lost their horses, but the men found the Indians and caught the Indians, I think, taking the tails off the horses, jerking the hair out of the tails on the horses. And they got the gun on them and the drop on them and took the horses back away. And I recall my grandmother said they didn't kill the Indians, which I'm kind of surprised they didn't. I also, the only other thing I recall much, grandmother telling about reaching Council Bluffs, Iowa, or Nebraska. I believe that's it. When the entire town came out to greet them, they thought all the wagon trains had been massacred by the Indians and were very amazed that these people came in and had not been attacked by the Indians. That's on the corner of Nebraska, just apparently where they cross the Missouri River, isn't it? Uh-huh. Yeah. But anyway, they went out to the Montrose, Telluride.
We can put it in later.
Yeah. Oh, what's the stop? The Silverton, Leadville area, and there apparently my grandmother's folks were raised. My mother was born, I believe, in the area of Montrose. My mother apparently was a telephone operator, as I recall, and these were hard times. I know she told me about my grandfather leaving her and her mother and a sister and a young brother. And this guy left them for almost a year, going down into Arizona and New Mexico. What they were doing, I don't know what, but anyway, they finally returned after almost a year. And here this poor old grandmother had to hack her the whole way by herself. And my mother is always quite bitter against her father. My mother was basically like men, but she would have been a real woman's liver if she'd have lived. Now, this is right up her alley. I think of my grandmother in one story that's delightful. Her husband had terrible rheumatism, apparently so bad that it was where he was completely bedfast. And my mother told me this story and cried each time she told it, how in the fall, apparently, some hired hand or something had stolen all their money. And my grandmother left from Montrose and went over the pass to Leadville to where an uncle lived, apparently extremely late in the year. And she went over this pass, and my grandfather was so arthritic he could just turn around in the wagon and point the road to my grandmother. Anyway, they stayed one night apparently on the pass above Gunnison or on the way to Leadville. And she put the horses in the barn and got him out, and they had a little abandoned cabin to stay in. And she got him in there into bed in this little cabin. And she heard her horses had got out of the barn and were out walking around. And she knew if the horses got away, there was snow on the ground then, that she'd die. And one of the horses were named Fanny, and she kept repeating Fanny's name, and got out, and this little gal got out and got a hold of these horses and got them back into the barn, and then tied them about 10 times to make sure they were there the next morning. Mm-hmm. She said, she told my mother that when they got to the edge of Leadville, of course it was, they came down out of the mountains in snow, and nobody had even came out of the mountains in a week or two. But they sent word to this, her Uncle Jess, and he came and carried her the whole way down the main street. And she stayed all winter there with this uncle and survived.
Mm-hmm. Going back, what did your, this is your grandmother on your mother's side, right?
Yes.
What did she look like physically?
Well, she's a tiny little woman, straight, little straight mouth. I'll have to show you, George. I've got a picture of grandmother that was taken when she's 85 years old. Is that going all the time?
Yeah, go ahead.
And anyway, I have this picture of grandmother rode a horse for 3 or 4 miles when she was 80 years old, and you can see she looks quite pert. Mm-hmm. Some of these pictures here are of later on. They were in Utah in the Ute Indian Reservation, and this grandpa was a trucker. They call them freighters. I guess freighter would be like a trucker nowadays, where he run freight wagons to apparently Salt Lake, and they were in this Indian reservation, and Mother has pictures of these Indian dances and the Indians that do it.
Did you ever meet your grandfather?
No, he died of a heart attack apparently. When my father married my mother, I believe she lived with him the entire time.
Yeah. But he was dead before you came along.
Yes, he was dead. Yeah. I think of some stories Mother was telling when they lived in apparently near Rangeley or in Watson, Utah. The Indians were all around, and they were about to go on a massacre. They were worried about the Indians going on a massacre, and I know my grandmother asked this good friend, this Indian, said, "Why, such and such, whatever his name was, you wouldn't kill me, would you?" And he said, "No, me got another Indian to kill you." He also was one of the funny things. There was apparently a hermaphrodite man with the Indians, and he always associated with the squaws. Quite obviously, you could see as a man, but he stayed with the squaws. And finally, my grandmother, who was extremely modest, asked this Indian man that apparently was their best friend, what about that man? She thought maybe he'd been disgraced in battle. Mm-hmm. No, he said, him man. No, he said, him buck, all the same time squaw. Yeah. Now, grandmother told stories continuously, and she had a very, she never remarried or never ever considered, I don't think, remarrying, and was quite religious, and a sweet little tough lady. She stayed out on the ranch with us and always took care of us children. Now, George, on my father's family, I know they came from Missouri. Apparently, the father and mother and 3 boys and 4 or 5 girls. My father told me that they stopped in Wilsonburg, Colorado, and he had a sister buried there that died. Nobody ever knew anything about the grave or anything like that. But then they went into Utah and established this cattle ranch, which would have been north of Cisco, Utah, and maybe south of Rock Springs, Wyoming. my father said that he and the brothers and father at one time run cattle from Rock Springs, Wyoming to, I believe, Moab, Utah, way south. And was a tremendous ranch. They apparently were the first people in there. Nobody was there ahead of them.
Did they homestead this land?
Yes, they homesteaded, but cattle people, in no way could they homestead enough land to control a ranch. Each person they hired, each cowboy and everything, also was entitled to a homestead. And the cattle rancher or cattleman actually would have them filed for a homestead, we'll say in the mouth of a canyon or on the water of a canyon. At the waters were always the headwater of a canyon. Maybe across a valley would block it. Each homestead, they were entitled to a homestead, which was 600 some odd acres, I believe. And also they were entitled to grazing ground. So they would prove up on this. I remember they would build a house on it. And as I recall, I know one time the cattleman would then buy, when they proved up on the ground, he'd buy it from this cowboy. And I remember the Negroes' homestead. They had the little shack there, and he never lived in it. But in order to prove up, in case they were checked, I know my folks took a whole gob of tin cans down there and put behind the building to show that he had lived in it.
What kind of houses did they usually build out there in that area?
Well, George, I hope I wish I could put this picture of this building. These were all, of course, log houses. And I recall that, and you can see this, this log house looks pretty crude, yet my aunt is standing on the front porch, and it does have a few boards on the front porch and a tiny 6-inch stoop. But this was at our Meadow Creek Ranch, was a 6-room log house. The roof had logs on it, and then they would just pile dirt on top of these logs, and if the roof ever leaked, we just went and got another wagon load of dirt and came and threw it on the top of the house. And this, as I recall, we had 3 bedrooms and a very, very large kitchen. When I see that kitchen, I always think of the time in the depth of winter. This foreman, name of Jim Thompson, he rode in there in a very, very cold winter day, and they had a cat that stayed at this ranch, and they had a small hole that he could get into the house. And anyway, this Jim rode up just at dusk and rode right up beside the house, jerked his saddle off and threw it against the house. And apparently the cat was asleep on the kitchen table because there was a string of manure the entire length of the table. When he got inside, it scared the cat absolutely to death.
Well, they look like they did a good job and everything. It's not the typical log cabin that you see portrayed in the movies and everything where...
Oh, no. This is cattle ranch. Where you would have, a very, you'd be bunking maybe 10 people. As you can see, there's the corrals down there and a tack room. The tack room that they kept their, harnesses and saddles in was covered and had a roof on it. None of the only other thing that would be covered would be a hen house. They'd cover a hen house, but all animals stayed out. Horses and cattle stood out in the weather all winter long and all summer long.
Now, where would they get their glass for windows? Was that a problem?
Well, no. This upper ranch, we would get a wagon into it once a year. It would be about a 3-day trip. It would go about 20 miles, but they would to come into this canyon, they would take a wagon and tie the wheels. They'd wrap log chains around the wheels so that when they pulled it, it would drag. And they would come down this mountainside, and sometimes they would put chains to trees to keep it from tipping and bring it down this mountainside. But once a year, we tried to come in, and we'd bring things like bed springs, and maybe a stove or something that you just absolutely couldn't get in on pack horses. And these cowboys were, of course, ingenious packing horses. I remember them packing stoves up on pack horses, and I always remember this. Once we put one of these great big pot-bellied stoves on this mule. We started out from the lower ranch, and we drove him about 3 miles, and the door came open on the stove and started swinging. Well, that started scaring the mule, and they had it lashed, real well, and he started to buck. And I know when that stove hit the ground, there wasn't a piece of metal in it as big as your hand. It just ruined the whole thing. Of course, they were cast iron, and it really wrecked it.
Let's describe what the inside of the ranch house looked like, and what kind of eating facilities, and how you cooked, and how they cooked in the ranch, and so forth.
Well, this is an interesting part of this type of world. Of course, realize this is in the Depression. When my father died, I think he left us $100 a month life insurance.
Mm-hmm.
This is unconcealable, but we were running this entire cattle ranch almost on $100 a month.
What year? Roughly.
Well, that was in 32. Well, my father died in 29, so it was 32, 33, 34, 35, and 36. But to describe a cattle camp, how they would eat in a cattle camp, when we were out on the range, we lived in beds wrapped up in tarpaulins. We had those, the beds were double, so that you slept the blankets below you and blanket above you, so it folded right down there. And of course, no sheets, but the tarpaulins flopped over the head, and they would, if it rained in the night, you could pull this tarpaulin down and at least cover you from the rain. Mm-hmm. You always slept in there. Your pants and shirt were your pillow. There never were pillows. And you put them under the blankets so that you'd sleep on those. Sometimes we could stay at this camp we call Little Jim, where we had a tent. And I think maybe the most wonderful sound in all the world was rain on this tent at daylight. Whenever it rained like that, I knew we didn't have to get up. And so I could sleep longer, and it'd be an easier day. When the cooking facilities were 2 Dutch ovens, maybe 3, but 2 Dutch ovens. And it's really amazing. The one guy when he made biscuits, he would take a sack of flour, 50-pound sack of flour, and roll the edges down and hollow a hole in the, just kind of a depression in the middle of the flour. And he'd pour water in there and baking powder, and he'd take a fork and just started going around the edge of this flour, working the flour into the water as he went. And he would work this up, and then he'd get it made into dough. And while he was making this, they would take these Dutch ovens, which are just metal pots with concave lids on them, and they would throw them right in the fire. They'd build a big roaring fire and throw them right in there and just get them as hot as they possibly could. And then when this fellow had the bread made, the biscuits made, he would take one of those Dutch ovens, set it off the side using a stick, and he had a swab rag, and he'd swab all the ashes and things like that out of there and put grease in. And then he'd pull some coals from the edge of the fire and set this Dutch oven on it. And he'd peach off a biscuit, and he would flap it through the grease and upside down and down in the grease at the bottom of this thing. And each one he'd slop through the grease and then flop it down so that it had grease under it and it had grease on the top of it. When he get this round Dutch oven filled with biscuits, he would then put the lid on. And before he put the lid on, he'd scrape coals into the concave top of the lid and set it on there. Then as it cooked, he would just take a stick and stick it through a kind of iron handle on the top of this lid and look at it. If it was browning too much, he would knock the ashes off the lid. If it was browning too much on the bottom, he'd set it off the coals. And you would just bake that, and really you'd be amazed. when they were hot, they just tasted great. When they get cold, you could knock a bull down with them, and, and they were just terrible. They get cold. Boy, they were heavy and soggy. But the meat, all we had was meat, and we cut the entire animal into steaks, right from the neck back, the shoulders, neck, backbone, and then down into the round, which is, of course, the best part of it. But they cooked it entirely into steaks. About the only sweets we did have honey, and that was always crystallized and sugared. And even to this day, I still hate honey. Another thing we would do for sweets would be we would take sugar and put in our plate and pour condensed milk on it and eat it with a spoon. And that really was a very good taste, that caramelized milk on it.
Did they have any vegetables? Would they ordinarily cook a vegetable?
No, never.
Never made a salad?
Never. No. Oh, no. We would have, when we get to the ranch now, we'd have vegetables in the summertime, and they would can all summer long, like beans and things like that. I do recall now for breakfast we would have salt side, and they called it sow belly, and actually it was about 4 or 5 inch thick slabs of sow belly cured in salt, and you would have to parboil that before you fried it. And of course for breakfast, like we have bacon nowadays, we'd have sow belly, and that still has got a wonderful taste to me, which is salt pork now. But you always had to parboil it. I remember my grandmother at the ranch used to take that and parboil it, and then dip it in milk and put a egg batter on it, and then dip it in flour, and boy, that'd be very good. Our meat, the only way we kept the meat in the summertime, every night it would be very cold, so you'd hang the meat out every night. That was the night chore, to hang the meat up on either on a tree or a rafter outside, so that it'd chill all night long. Then in the morning, before sunup, we would take a seamless sack and drop that meat down in it and take it in and fold our beds over it and try and hold that cold as long as you can. And actually the meat would last about 10 days that way. We would try and kill deer. We felt we protected the deer and took care of them, and we would try and kill buck deer. We almost nobody would ever kill a doe, but we'd try and kill buck deer and eat that if we possibly could. Since I liked that, I was the one that always tried to kill the deer, and I did most of the hunting. But in the ranches, the women made bread, light bread, and of course it was marvelous light bread. Some women could make marvelous light bread. Some women could just absolutely turn out the soggiest old green, gray-looking bread, and it'd just be terrible. And each farmer or ranch hand we'd hire, the wife generally would cook at one of the ranches, and you surely got a quick reading on her in a hurry when you saw the kind of bread she made. But even on the ranches, we did have some chickens. I remember this upper ranch that I'm describing, I have the picture of here. We carried the chickens up horseback, and we'd put them in sacks and cut a hole in there and take the chicken's head out and carry them clear up to the upper ranch, and then they'd lay their eggs. And as I recall, the last bunch that I carried up there, some of the adjoining cattlemen stopped in there late in November, and there wasn't anything to eat they had, and they killed every last chicken and ate it, which was their privilege of doing. You did this sort of thing, but I know my mother always complained about this neighbor never ever replaced all their chickens that he ate, and I think he must have eaten 8 or 10 of them that night.
How long would they stay up on this upper ranch? How many months?
Well,
obviously they couldn't stay up when it was snowing and that.
Well, yes, they stayed. We fed half our cattle at the upper ranch. See, we made hay at this upper ranch. Now, up on although they called it the mountain, when we were up there, the cattle were up on the mountain all summer, and we stayed in these pack beds and pack horses and followed moved to different camps and different places like that. Grouping the cattle up, your basic idea was to brand the calves and vaccinate them. The new calves are arriving. They tried to distribute the bulls and keep, sometimes the bulls, 2 or 3 of them would get to a different. The bulls were real smart. They would stay at the waters or the salt licks where they knew all the cows had to come. They never would, I don't know how they stayed in condition, but they would stay at these waters all the time and check every cow. And the cows sometime would go, maybe 6 miles in the water once a day and back to their calves.
How many head of cattle would they have up there?
Well, I don't know, but at the time when they put the Taylor Grazing Act in, which allowed you so many cattle to run on this government grain and stop the terrible fighting over range, we got the largest grant in Utah, which I believe was 1,000 head. I know we would have 450 to 500 calves a year, which don't sound very good in percentage, but we'd also have yearlings and 2-year-olds not being bred.
What were these fights? Do you remember any of those fights among the farmers and their ranchers?
Well, there were no farmers per se. There were homesteaders, and there was never trouble with homesteaders. The biggest problem, and my earliest recollection, we had this Negro cattle foreman that was half Negro and half Cherokee Indian called Charlie Glass. And my earliest recollection is when Charlie, of course, he was my hero, and I recall that Charlie shot this sheep herder. It's hard to understand, but the first people on the range claimed it, and they had to hold this ground by actually no one could afford to own all this government ground. So the first rancher in there, what he run on was his, and he had to hold it actually by just brute strength and awkwardness. There was no other way. My father, as I recall, said that the sheep and the sheep herder were in sight of our ranch. This is apparently in the wintertime, and anyone that has followed sheep and cattle know that sheep actually, if they overgraze an area, they will starve a cow to death. So anyway, this Negro went out and to warn this Basque, and apparently the Basque had been hired as gunman, because when Charlie rode up, the Basque started shooting at him, and Charlie unbuttoned his shirt and shot 3 times. He carried an automatic. He shot 3 times, and the 3rd time was right smack between the guy's eyes. But I know this took tremendous expense and tremendous fighting with lawyers on my father's part to get this colored man off this charge of murder. And the old gentleman swore allegiance to my father for all the rest of his life, since he'd saved him from going to the pen. This colored man came from Oklahoma. His father, they said, his head was brought in a sack, this colored man's father. This colored man knew Will Rogers when he was a youth, and apparently was very close to the same age, and had not associated with Will Rogers, but knew him and had met him when they were young people. The old colored man told about he had been up and down the Santa Fe Trail 3 or 4 times, and I think of him telling that the entire thing they built fires with, and all the firewood, anything they ever used, was entirely buffalo chips. I mean, that's the only thing they burned. And he also told about them having to put half shoes on cattle, that they would walk so far that they would get so tender on their feet that they couldn't walk any further. And they would have to throw them down and put shoes on them. I also went to college. When I went to college, I was taught jurisprudence by a doctor, I believe Glover, as I recall, and he had, in his early days, he'd been a veterinarian along the Santa Fe Trail, and he'd made a living spaying heifers. They would spay heifers, apparently very early years, and then, of course, they would sell as steers would at a higher price. And but anyway, the Negro, Charlie Glass, was half Negro and half Cherokee Indian, and he always carried a gun. That I never recall him being without a gun. I generally had an automatic. He carried a Luger for a while, and then a great big six-shooter with a 45 six-shooter. I don't know that at any distance I never ever saw him kill a deer, and I saw him shoot at him a great many times. But apparently close, he would be pretty deadly. He really, if I ever knew a tough person, he would have been it.
Mm-hmm. How many worked on the ranch? How many men usually?
There was generally 4 cowboys, and they would have maybe 4 hired hands. The ranch, the ranches per se, we did nothing but put up hay to feed these cows in the wintertime. Mm-hmm. This upper ranch, why we used bull rakes, and of course you stacked all the hay. Mm-hmm. I generally, the young kid had to run the stacker horse and clean up around the stack, and we had one guy stacking hay and probably 2 men running buck rakes to bring the hay to there. We'd cut it down, and these rakes run along like teeth under hay, and would get big stacks of it and bring it to the stacks. We had an overshot stacker. Incidentally, I came in with my father from Mack, Colorado, with this stacker, and as I recall, it took us 4 or 5 days. We camped out in this wagon, bring this stacker up. As I recall, maybe the name of the creek we went up was Dry Gulch. But anyway, we went up and over and down, and we had a 6-horse team to pull this up and down, this complete stacker. And whenever anything would break on the stacker, these hired hands would just put an axe over their shoulder and go to the mountainside and cut down a tree and hew that thing out and shape it up and make these parts over. And about the only thing left, as I recall, of the stacker was the springs left. That's the only thing that of the original stacker the last time I saw it.
That's something they couldn't duplicate then.
Well, that's right. Of course, anything would really break, like in a mower. Why, Lord, then we had 15 miles down to Lower Place, and then get in this truck and go a day to town, and maybe the parts weren't even available. It'd just a breakdown would just kill you.
Tell about when you were younger and celebrating Christmas with your family.
Well, I actually don't recall my father anything like that of Christmas. I recall later on, after the Depression hit, of course, we moved to this cattle ranch. As I commented earlier, Mormonism was taught in the Utah schools. In the high schools, you had Mormonism taught. That time, I'm sure it isn't that way now, and I never ended up bitter with Mormons. But I was sent from my 8th grade on to a Presbyterian boarding school at Mount Pleasant, Utah. And so anyway, we'd go there in September, and we would apparently either our parents would get or we'd get a ride over to Vernal, and our parents would come in and get us and take us to this ranch at Christmas time. Now, as I got older, there would always be the Christmas dance with the homesteaders, which is actually one of the most unbelievable things in the world. They would dance apparently about 30 miles away, 20, 30 miles down in a schoolhouse. My sister and I believe, are the only people that from that entire country that ever went to college. I believe my sister and I and maybe a cousin was the only ones that ever even got beyond the 8th grade. But anyway, we would go down, and these homesteaders would come probably from a 40-mile area, and they would generally hire an orchestra. I mean, some lady that'd play a piano, and maybe a fellow banjo, I can't recall. But all these homesteaders would go there. They would take all their children and put them to bed in one room, and it was tradition that they danced all night. And if they got booze, which they always tried to do, generally it'd end up about midnight. They would always queue up certain people to fight, And there would be these terrible fights among these men, who could whip who, and they'd probably been promoting this for, probably from the summer before, who could whip who and what. This was their world. They didn't have a lot else. And anyway, the women would be crying and screaming, and these men would be fighting, or we'd die. I was generally the peacemaker, trying to stop them from fighting and keep them from fighting. But you cannot believe these women, when you danced, basically it took a dog trot and went around this floor, and around and around and around, and of course I would have to dance with all the women, since I was actually the only college person in the whole outfit. I would dance with every one of them, and oh my Lord, you've never seen a dance like they do. I do recall one time that the orchestra didn't come, and everybody was a 4th of July dance, as I recall, at my uncle's place north of us. And anyway, one guy rubbed on a washboard up and down to keep kind of like these Mexicans are with these things they rub down in Mexico. And another guy beat on a dishpan, and these people danced all night long to this noise, to that music, and right on till daylight.
You want to talk about education, about starting in grade school and what facilities they had in the high school and go on from there? My education, is a reflection of the parents. I was always going to go to college. I did, when I graduated my senior year, I thought I was going to be a cowboy, or at least considered it. I did stay out on the ranch. The only time I ever did till November. I had a bad run of luck. But before I got ahead of that, in November in the fall, you bring all the animals down to these ranches, see, and you bring the calves down, the cows and the calves, and you wean the calves. Now, I always recall this upper ranch. When we had weaned them, those calves, morning and night, would bawl for about 7 days. The cows would bawl, the calves would bawl all night long, all day long. But you get them weaned, and then you would start them out for market. And we would drive those calves 7 days to market. And I've always wondered, now that I doctor animals, how these little guys ever lived. Been weaned, where they bawled for 4 or 5 days, and then they would drive those animals 7 days and night herd them. There were no corrals or anything like that. They'd night herd them every night. And these poor little things had never seen any hay or anything like that, and they'd feed them hay and get them to market and sell them. I just wonder how any of them ever survived, and it was really a rough way to go. Now, this last year when I decided to be a cowboy, I was riding, if I recall, 6 or 7 horses in a string. Each cowboy would had his own string of horses that he would ride on successive days. And this... you would take them with you all the time? Yes. We would have they'd call it a caddy of horses, so we'd have about 40 horses steadily. Our pastures are very large. They would be a number of miles long that these horses would graze. You wouldn't ever get all the horses. We'd have bells on all of them. It was about impossible. I always recall I had to wrangle horses in the summertime, and I'd have bells on. I'd have maybe 20 bells on these horses, and there'd only be 40 some odd. And when I'd get out there at daylight, I could not hear one damn bell. Those horses at daylight would know to stop, because if they got picked up, why, of course, they'd get ridden that day, or at least they stood a chance. And you would not hear a sound. I know I just about cried. Be so aggravated that you could not find all these horses. I never found all the horses. But anyway, I had, I think, 6 successive horses fall with me in a week or 10 days' time. Each horse was a different horse that fell, and one of them ruptured. And the time I was ruptured, I remember I was running down a mountainside as hard as a horse would go, and we hit the brush in the bottom, which was sagebrush, which would be almost as high as a horse's shoulder, and we ran off into a creek wash, and the horse was running so fast he hit the other side of the creek and knocked him flat, and I was
he was down in the bottom of this narrow canyon or creek wall, which must have been 6 or 8 foot deep, and I was on top of him, fortunately. But as he struggled to get up, I got hit by either the horn or the handle of the saddle somehow, but I did come up on top of him, and we rode out down there till we could get out of this valley, or creek. You see these creeks weren't very big, but they would cut down maybe 12 feet, just walls, straight dirt walls on these canyons.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, at the time they left to take the cattle in, which is the highlight of the year for a cowboy, I found that I was ruptured, and I went down and got the family car and went into the town of Vernon, Utah. This is unbelievable, but I think I was either 16 or 17. I went in, made all arrangements for an operation, picked out my doctor, told him how I wanted operated, and he operated on me. I told him I wanted a local anesthetic because I was so treated Edith so bad. And this old sweetheart, this Dr. Eskelson, operated on me and run out a local anesthetic and finally gave me chloroform. And after 7 or 8 days, my parents stopped into town to see what had happened to me. This don't hardly seem possible, but I stayed in this little hospital in Vernal and became very good friends with Mrs. Murray that run the hospital, and her daughter and the nurse, and a what would be a nurse's aide now. I dated all 3 of the gals. After this, instead of going to a hotel, I'd always go to the hospital and stay when I got in the town of Vernal and have an absolute picnic with these gals.
When you were in high school, had you decided on your career? Or?
No, I really hadn't. And I was really frightened, and I'm sure every young person must be frightened on what their career is going to be. I don't think I decided till I may have been in the hospital when I decided I'd. One of the influencing things, though, following this operation, this was in November, and I came out and stayed on the ranch till January, and I couldn't work. At that time, they wouldn't let you work with a rupture in your recovery for 6 months. So I really went to college. I went to Brigham Young, and I really just went to see a girl I knew went there. I never went with any idea of basically going to college. And went and visited this girl at Brigham Young at that time. The kids lived in apartments. These girls lived in apartments, and all the boys lived in apartments, and this was really a going deal. It seemed strange, though, that there was maybe 5 or 6 girls that were as a group, and 5 or 6 boys, and, I was the only one that passed in the whole outfit. And I was the only one that was really there for a lark. They were all basically going to college. But college was actually, when I got to college, it was, it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. And I never, ever dreamed of going back to this ranch again. I decided to become a veterinarian. A little incident. The next year, I really hadn't investigated being a veterinarian at all, but I understood that Utah Aggies, they must teach veterinary medicine. So, the next fall, and when I'd come off this ranch, during my time on the ranch in the summertime, I'd never shave. I would probably not wear a shirt the entire summer. I just wear Levi's and cowboy boots this entire. There was no girls. There was no nothing. So when I'd go to town, it'd take me about a week till I'd feel comfortable with girls or other people. This year, when I decided to go to college, I went into Vernal, and I found out when Utah State started, and it was probably the middle of September. So I stayed at the hospital for 4 or 5 days and attended the rodeo in Vernal, which was always an absolute debacle. The Indians would always get drunk, and it would just be an absolute crazy deal. Then I went into Salt Lake and visited another girlfriend and stayed there for 3 or 4 days. Then I went up to Utah State and got a room and met some kids. And Monday morning, I went up to register, and it turned out they didn't even teach veterinary medicine. I called Colorado, and I had 3 days to enroll in Colorado before they closed. They'd been going 2 weeks. So I jumped on the train and got to Fort Collins, Colorado, and got registered. Just as I recall, it was the last day that I could have registered to take veterinary medicine, and I was late then, maybe 2 weeks. It was unbelievable. I didn't even know what a fraternity was, and I stopped 2 boys on the street and asked them if they knew any place where I could go to a boarding house, a good boarding house. And these 2 boys visited with me, and
Yeah, we'll get to that. All right. Yeah, go ahead and talk. We're talking about the University of Colorado.
all right. Well, anyway, these fellows asked me if I knew Chuck Plumley, and I said, well, yes, I know Chuck. I graduated from high school with him. Well, they said, why don't you come up to the house and meet him? And I said, sure. And of course, I didn't know what a fraternity. These guys took me up and pledged me to the Sigma Phi Epsilon fraternity. They were desperate for pledges. This was in 1934, 35, I guess 35. And they just moved into a great big house. These turned out I got pledged to the best fraternity and the largest one on the campus. And I didn't even know what a fraternity was. It was unbelievable. My cost at that time for board and room and fraternity dues was $35 a month. And I think my spending money was $5 for the entire month. This was a crazy time. My folks were at the ranch, and I couldn't get any money to enroll in college, and I had to go see the president every week and tell him, well, now, sir, when my parents get to town, they'll send me the money to pay the entrance fees. But I'd had such a good time that what money I had and the train trip over to Colorado, I never end up with anything enough for tuition. But in time, I got my tuition, and everything turned out all right. I don't believe I'd have passed if I hadn't joined the fraternity. There was 12 of us. No, I believe there was 6 of us that were vet students, and we studied together. It's unbelievable now. I flunked the first anatomy quiz, and they cut a class from 80 pre-vets or freshman vets. They cut this class down to 40 by Christmas. And when I graduated, I think there was 13 or 14 of this class left that graduated. And then we had the largest graduating class in vets that had ever been. But I never had a date. I don't believe till spring. We would study every entire weekend. When we'd have an anatomy quiz, we would study 2 and 3 days. I recall that I could tell every page number on the pages of this anatomy book. Unbelievable. You just memorized it absolutely. Even memorized the footnotes so you could write the footnotes verbatim. We would get 10 questions in anatomy, and we'd write 4 to 5 hours on them. It was just that serious.
Was there a lot of competition among students and for these spots in the veterinary school or not? Or they just weeded you out?
We were just weeded out. The thing was, there was no rule against how many persons could enroll in vet school. This is apparently the first time there had been more than just a few want to enroll, and so they were overwhelmed with them. And I know they kicked 2 boys out because they got drunk at a football game at the University of Wyoming in Laramie in another state. They kicked them out. They did everything. The last 2 that failed, I recall this Dr. Fargson, who was, I believe, the meanest man I've ever known, the toughest, meanest, most partial man I ever knew, and maybe one of the most brilliant. He flunked 2, a Jewish boy and a colored boy out of our class, the only Jew and the only colored boy. He flunked them out of class 6 weeks before graduating with an A average for going to sleep in class, and they had been studying for another quiz. He was a mean man. I don't think possible.
Would you go home for the holidays then from college?
Yes, generally would. I'd take a bus over through, I'd go over Berthoud Pass and through Steamboat and Craig, Colorado, and out to the ranch, out to Vernal, and then my parents would meet me in this. And actually, it was a truck. Our car, this extreme depression was about 1.5 ton truck. I'd go out to this ranch in. That's another story in itself. Our truck trips out to this ranch. It was 80 miles and when these homesteaders would irrigate, the water would always be in the road, and it would always be muddy. I remember one time when we finally had to get a team of horses to pull this truck out, when my stepfather and I dug on this truck, trying to get it out of the middle of the road, and there was a flood. At that day, there was a flood, and I was going down the middle of the road in my pants leg, rolled up barefooted, trying to find the road, and my stepfather's following me across this meadow. Well, we stuck this truck, and when we finally gave up and went and got a team of horses, the bed was absolutely level with the ground. It was just, we dug that long and that hard on this thing. Yeah. Awful.
Now, your father died at a relatively early age, and
well, yes, my father apparently was quite a bit older than my mother. My mother and father went together before she was married the first time, and she married a Mac Smith, a mining engineer. My mother is really quite a character. She and this Smith placer mined the Green River. They had a gold mine, and they apparently they lived out there, and she would take the gold to market, and he would work, and he was a consultant engineer, and he was killed when he was on apparently some consulting assignment that he leaned over to pick up a wire to go under. It was a electrical wire, and he was electrocuted. But my mother run that darn gold mine, I don't know how long, but she run it a while afterwards, this placer mine, and she had an automatic that she carried and took the gold to, I don't know, I assume it was in the Vernal. She went on from then to Salmon, Idaho, and run a dress shop. I recall of her referring to Salmon, Idaho, and seeing people walk down with these great big salmon down the street. And anyway, she came back and apparently married my father then.
Had he been married before?
No, but he was a number of years. He must have been 40. It's unbelievable. My father died at 50, and I always recall the cowboys referring to him as Old Oscar. My father was an old man. It's unbelievable, but he was old all my life. He never herded cattle with the cowboys. I've always felt badly once. Apparently it was, of course, these cowboys would get up. Now when we were out in a cattle camp, we'd get up at daylight and go and we'd eat breakfast, and then we'd never eat till maybe 4 or 5 in the evening. We'd come back to camp, and of course we never had any light, so we went to bed at dark. And they would eat nothing but fried food. Actually the biscuits, you'd call them fried. And so all of them were old men. I can't hardly believe here I am 60, and my father was a terribly old man at 50.
You remember him as looking old?
Yes, looking old and acted old. I only recall once that he went out. They had horses in there, and to brand horses, they would run them around a corral, and a roper would step out and throw and rope them by the front feet. The horse would be running, and they would spin a rope right out in front and pick up his front feet, and they'd just throw a horse right down, just jerk his feet right out from under him, turn him upside down. And I know my father went out to front foot these horses, and of course this Negro was there, and I hollered and said, "Dad, get away and let Charlie rope," because I imagine anything Charlie could do in the cowboy line would be a million times better than my father. But when I read about my father's obituary, it turned out he was considered to be the finest roper that had ever been in this country, and that was his notoriety of being the finest roper. And I recall Dad told me once about being out on a range, and a Mexican sheep herder or Mexican cowboy said he saw this animal over there, and they realized they had a mountain lion.
Mm-hmm.
And these cowboys rode around this bunch of brush, or rode around and got closer and closer, and he said finally the lion reared up, and he roped the lion, and another man roped it, and they choked it to death. But apparently he must have just been something. These ropers, I saw one other really good roper, and this man could rope a calf by its feet and wrap the rope around the saddle horn, all in the same thing. Now, when you rope an animal by the feet, you have to keep tension on it all the time, and he could pick up that tension and hold onto that leg and wrap it around the saddle horn all the time. And he was the only man I ever saw that could rope and wrap all the rest of the cowboys always had the rope tied hard and fast to the saddle horn.
We talked about your mother's physical characteristics, but in the short years that your father lived, what did he look like? Was he a big man or a small man? Did he have his hair or more glasses?
Well, no, he was bald-headed, as I recall, and he wore glasses. This is my father and his brother, and you can see, and apparently those guys were very near worth $250,000 in cattle at that time. This isn't him as they were, I don't believe they're even at a ranch, but they might have been at some ranch there, but you can see. Mm-hmm. He was apparently looked sort of like I do, but he was bald-headed. Uh-huh. But he was ill basically all my life. He was always on health foods and stomach trouble, and I don't think I ever knew my father well. My father and mother my mother didn't marry my father for love, and it was really a bad marriage, even though they never got a divorce, but mm-hmm. they had very little in common, and I don't ever recall that they ever slept together. Mm-hmm. Must have occasionally, but I slept with my father, and my sister slept with my mother always, as much as I ever recall.
Yeah. In a personal, did he accumulate a lot of money?
He didn't accumulate a lot of money. Dad had, as you realize, the biggest cattle ranch in Utah. Mm-hmm. When he died, he had an $80,000 debt, which was nothing. When people my mother, of course, complained and harangued him, because every time somebody started getting too big around him, he'd buy them out. And actually, an $80,000 debt was nothing at that time. But when he became ill, we went to Arizona his final year. And when the Depression hit, my mother sold part of the cattle and cleared off $40,000 of that debt. And by the next year, the ranch and the cattle and everything was only worth half the remaining $40,000. And just, you can't believe how the bottom fell out of things. And of course, he died. Mm-hmm. And this ranch would be worth millions now. My cousin tells me that they sold their ranch one year. They sold and gave a Mrs. Merripp an option on the ranch. She paid money down and had an option. And he said, by then, we started to realize what this Taylor grazing grant was worth. And he said, with the bank and with help, he said, we were able to offer Mrs. Merripp $1 million for her Taylor grazing grant from my uncle's ranch. And she laughed at it. Mm-hmm. So this ranch that my parents sold at 35 would now be worth millions. And
he, in other words, and by the time the Depression came and he had died and everything else, they were broke for all practical purposes.
Well, yes, the ranch went broke, but of course it was they weren't broke. They were worth less than what they owed. But of course, everybody was in the same boat. I'll have to tell you some of the stories my father told me.
Well, we were talking about.
Oh, I apparently my father's parents, they lived someplace near this Meadow Creek Ranch. They lived down in Willow Creek, and I can't even recall the name of the place, but they had left this ranch, apparently where his parents had been. And anyway, he tried to show me. They lost a hired hand once there. He died. And he tried, my father took me once, just for fun. We were riding past there to try and show me where this guy was buried. But apparently the canyon had washed away where he'd been buried. But I know my father and mother, or his father and mother, both of them were carried out. They both died out in there, and they're carried out on pack horses with their head in one panniard and their feet in the other, that must be a pretty depressing way to see your parents go out to Fruta to be buried. This Negro Indian was finally killed. I believe they made a picture on this Charlie Glass, this Negro, now, and he's written up in a number. I know he's written up in the Denver Post as being one of the real bad men or heroes, or however you want to write it. But he was killed riding with some sheep herders and some Mexicans in a truck. It turned over and he was killed. There was always doubt in some people's mind whether he maybe was murdered, because some of these people were relatives of the man he'd killed, this Basque sheep herder. But anyway, I attended the funeral of this colored man. It was the largest funeral they ever had in this town, and there wasn't one colored person at this funeral. He was, I'm sure, was respected by every cattleman that ever knew him.
Were there many blacks out in that area?
Oh, none. Oh, no.
Yeah.
No, this guy was half Indian, and I recall of course, he had a lot of influence on me. I slept with him innumerable times. In fact, I used to sleep with this old colored man. He was the cleanest man that ever was. He generally made the biscuits, which is something I recall. One funny story. We used to have sourdough, and sourdough actually was a light bread starter that they would add water and probably sugar each time. They would pour out the dough and then add water and sugar to this little jar of dough, and the next time they would just pour out the dough again and then mix more flour with it. One time this colored man, when we were staying at this camp at Little Jim with a tent, he forgot and left the lid off the sourdough, and while we were gone that day, why, chipmunks had got up and got to playing, and one of them had jumped in there, and of course drowned in his sourdough jug. And this other old cowboy, he walked up there and saw this, and he never cracked a smile. He just put the lid back on and fastened it. And of course, the old colored man, when he poured out the sourdough that night, outpoured this chipmunk, and he couldn't imagine how this chipmunk got in and put the lid back on.
Were those happy days, really?
Oh yes, but they're not as happy as I'm having now. Yes, they were fairly happy days. It's hard to know. I really felt I was raised in a rather unhappy home, and I was always praying to get someplace and do something. My sister and I it's kind of funny, we were left alone quite a bit. I remember once, one of the real strange stories, and as I recall, one of the worst positions I ever got into. My sister and I found a hawk nest. We were at this ranch where there was just rock cliffs up for thousands of feet. As you can see by some of these pictures, it's just nothing but rim rocks up. Well, we found this hawk's nest, and we always wanted a baby hawk. So I went out there and with her, and we could get to this hawk's nest, but it must have been about 12 feet from this ledge up to the nest. And so the only way I could see it getting it was getting my sister on my shoulder, and I got her up on my shoulder against this rock rim and was going to have her pick out this hawk out of the nest. And so I eased out on this ledge, and it was a long ways down below me, and got her up there, and she was high enough to reach in this nest, but just about the time she reached for this hawk, this little bitty hawk jumped up and threw its wings out at her and scared her, and she started to scream and cry. And about that time, the mother hawk started dive bombing her, and I could not. There was no way. I had to ease back with her on my shoulder and get her back to where I could let her down. And I've never spent a worse time trying to get her back to a decent ledge, and this mother hawk was coming at her just like a dive bomber right at her face, and she was screaming and crying, and I could not let her down, and we finally got off this ledge, and I'd had enough of that. It was kind of funny. We played. I know we had this blacksmith shop that with anvil, and we'd make things out of iron. There was black powder there, and I know we'd take black powder and run strings of black powder for maybe 100 yards and light it on fire to watch it shoot, the length of the black powder. When we'd have 4th of July, we'd generally buy they would maybe get $5 worth of fireworks, but apparently that would buy quite a bit. These cowboys would get up on these rims and shoot these skyrockets and fireworks out over the ranch, and it was really quite spectacular. The $5 was quite a bit of fireworks at that time.
How did your mother then remarried the third time after your father died?
Yes, she remarried an Englishman, a fellow that worked in I don't know. He was really a pretty nice man. Tracy, I've had regrets about Tracy because we had fist fights and terrible times. He used to be able to beat the living hell out of me till the last fist fight we had. I jumped up and got a lucky punch in and knocked him absolutely flat. It just knocked him as cold as a mackerel. And it scared me absolutely to death. I thought I'd killed him. And I got down and helped him, got him back up, and then he beat the devil out of me. But I never could get him to fight after that. I knew that I could cream him, but we never had a fight after that.
What was his background?
Well, I don't know. He was a salesman type of person. My mother, I don't think, ever used tremendous judgment in her marriages. I always felt bad because Mother was very beautiful and could have married any man in the world, and she had, during her courtship after my father's death, she had some really men with a lot of money and seemingly very nice men that wanted to have something to do with her, and my gosh, she picked this other man that there was nothing wrong with him, but he didn't have a dime, and although, as I understand, this man went on and became after my mother divorced him, he became quite successful in real estate and was worth some money later in his life.
After you finished college, then what happened?
Well, after I finished college, this was still the Depression, and
what year? 38?
1939.
39.
Still the Depression, and I know Amy and I went to Rifle, Colorado, and they offered us a job. I think we got $100 a month for the meat inspection job, plus I was to practice veterinary medicine in the town. And Rifle, Colorado, nowadays probably is a delightful location, and there was innumerable cattle around this area, but I imagine I'd have starved to death in 30 days. So we decided to, I was in college with a boy named Ben Blood that was from LaFontaine near Wabash, and he influenced me to come to Indiana. All the graduates, actually, there was 6 graduates, came to 3 in Illinois and 3 in Indiana from my class, and I'm the only one left of all of them. All the rest of them have all gone into other things and everything like that. But my first job, I went, my wife and I, we were married, and I had a job to vaccinate the horses in southeast Colorado in the corner of the one county. And that was in the Dust Bowl, and we went down there, and I made $60. I remember it was we stayed in an apartment that never had any blinds on. I think there was, in the bathroom in front of the bathtub, there was a oilcloth for a blind, and it was torn about half off, so my wife always said she felt like a goldfish every time she took a bath. I did make $60. That was the most depressing place I've ever been, because these people had just gone off and left their homes completely. They had like clothes on the line and mattresses and everything. They just left. Everything they could put in the car, they took it, and and left this dust bowl. It was awful, absolutely terrible. I went to this one place I know to vaccinate this man's horses. He'd signed up, and it would only cost him $1 a horse to vaccinate him for sleeping sickness. But anyway, he said, young man, he said, look up on that hill. Can you see that green? I said, yes, sir. Well, he said, that's the first green I've seen in 8 years. Now, he said, you look over there at the field. He said, you see that bear? Yes. He said, there come the grasshoppers. And when I left this man's place, I think I drove a quarter of a mile on nothing but grasshoppers. There were that many grasshoppers that you couldn't even see the ground. There were that many grasshoppers, and I didn't vaccinate this guy's horses. And I always said I'd never work for people that poor. I just couldn't do it. Terrible. So then we came back to Fort Collins for a night, and then we left and went to Indiana. And
did it take much to sway your decision, or you figured it couldn't be any worse here?
No, I had no choice. Yeah. No choice. There was nothing in Colorado. I've always thought the town of Greeley, there was only 2 veterinarians in there, and I didn't even consider the town of Greeley. And later on now, as I understand, there's 10 to 15 veterinarians, and it's the largest feeding area in probably the United States, or a tremendous feeding area, but I didn't even dream it would be a practice in Greeley or any of these towns. But I came to Indiana, and this salesman told us that Flora, Indiana was the place to go. And of course, we were fast running out of money, and as I recall, I had $10 when I got in Flora. We rented a room with housekeeping privileges, and I took this lady's garage. She didn't have a car, and I tried to make an office in the garage, and I practiced out of this garage in Flora. And it was a long time before I got $10 a head. I guess the nicest people ever were, they were to us. We were taken in the town and entertained, and became a part of a group of people very quickly. And even though we had absolutely nothing, as I recall, I'd make a call, then I'd stop and pay for the gas I'd use, and I'd generally get $3 or $4, so I'd have $1 for groceries. My first Christmas, I gave Amy all the money I had, which was $5, and we went to Chicago. And anyway, we visited her brother up there. But when I came back, I ran out of gas on the way back, and never had a cent. I had to go talk a farmer into giving me a fruit can of gas to pour in the car and get back to Flora. It was awful. No parents, no nothing, and as I recall, then I went from shortly after Christmas till 2nd or 3rd of January before I ever got a call, and I sit broke this entire time, charging groceries and wondering what was going to happen to me.
This is in 39, then.
Yes. Yeah. Then this doctor from Columbia City came and hired me. This friend of mine, Ben Blood, had worked for him, and Ben came to Wabash to locate, and he came down and hired me. And when I told him, I really debated, because I was determined I was going to make good in Flora, but the best advice I could get, everybody thought I should go with this Dr. Columbia City, and turned out whatever I am, I owe to this old doctor because of his integrity and knowing how to conduct a large business. A young man, you just don't know how to handle a big business unless you have handled it, and how to handle people and do all these things. I recall one of the saddest things when I was practicing, Amy and I felt everything had to be boiled for every operation or anything. And so one day I got a milk fever call, which was actually my easiest call and the most appreciated. So I put my intravenous outfit on to boil and was doing something. My wife was to watch it, and she forgot and let this intravenous outfit burn up. And then I couldn't treat this cow, and I never have been worse panicked, I believe, in my life. I needed that call so badly, and there's no way I could treat this cow.
So it was touch and go starting out then.
Yes, terribly. I think that there was a Dr. Hufty heard about me. course, I was delivering calves and cleaning cows and doing all this obstetrical work, and I would strip down to waist. And I was stripping down to the waist, bare, absolutely bare, with not even rubber pants on. And this old doctor heard about me doing that, and the old sweetheart, he went and bought me a sheepskin vest and brought it over. This other veterinarian brought it over to me and gave it to me and told me to wear that because my little wife didn't have to bury her husband so soon. And I remember this old guy used to come and pick me up. I, of course, didn't have much, and he was a big-time veterinarian. He'd pick me up and take me with me on calls, and was very kind to me and helped me in a great many ways.
Was it the fact that the farmers had no money, or the veterinarians were not in demand, or what was the combination of both? Or?
Well, yeah, I guess that's it. For this was still the Depression. Pigs, I think, were maybe a nickel at that time. I remember you would vaccinate for hog cholera, and the price was 32 cents a pig, and that wasn't 32 and a half cents a pig. It was 32 cents a pig, and of course, a great deal of that was for the vaccine. This area that I did locate in, the prices were very, very low. I'm so happy I left, because a young person starving to death, there's no way he can set a high price. You just can't do it. I can set a price now, you know, and handle it very well, but you can't do that when you're starting out. And we were doing all these things for just almost nothing. The only competition I had in this town was an old doctor that was about an alcoholic. He was no problem, but you know, when a business deteriorates, there was maybe 12 veterinarians doing business in this area that, you know, had become established, so that I was competing against 12 or 15 veterinarians, and it was a rough old go. I'm so happy I moved.
Well, go ahead and develop the career.
Oh, well, of course, the career goes on and on. I worked for this old doctor for 2 years, and he is the most wonderful man in the world. He was absolutely great and tremendous integrity. And I know my agreement, the first month I had to work for $100, and then $125 the second month, the third month $150. And anyway, about the first week or 10 days, I had a good background in education, and I know the first or second week he was ill. The old sweetheart had a heart attack, or had heart trouble, and he was not feeling well. And I went out and did a urethrotomy. That's where animal has a calculi in the penis, and you actually cut the penis and sew it to the outside and make a steer into a heifer, or a heifer into a steer, or a steer into a heifer. You know, and they urinate out behind. Well, I did this operation for him, and I came back, and he said, "Did you do it successfully?" And I said, "Yeah, I believe I did." Well, he said, "From now on," he said, you're at full price." And as I recall, I was getting $150 a month, and that don't sound like much, but all the friends, you know, I know some guy is almost running a grocery store. I became friends with some beard boys, and one of them was working for $17 a week, and the guy that was almost running the store had $20 a week income, and so I was really rolling in dough compared to anybody else, and of course immediately I started saving money, and that was innermost in my mind to save money from then on. I can't. Then of course I had the opportunity to buy in Wabash. This doctor came up and offered to sell me his practice. And of course, he thought he had a pretty good deal if he could just sell it in the Depression. And he sold, I don't know what, but I don't even recall the price, and I think I've thrown the contract away. It was not a lot, but it was $1,000 or $2,000 for all these instruments and all these blood vials and everything. And so I came down here. I left this old doctor, and with much misgivings, and he later on, he had a nephew that was going to go in with him, and he later on said, "I should never have let you go." But this nephew was coming in, and I went on, and I came down here the day of Pearl Harbor, and I had a commission in the Army, so that was an extremely upsetting day. I had all my money that I'd saved, and might have been $1,000, plus I owed this doctor 1,000 or so, or maybe more. I don't know what it was, but I know that when I went into the Army a year later, I paid off everybody. I paid off what I owed on the practice a year later, and I ended up with absolutely no money at all. I had paid it off, and I hoped I'd established myself, but when I left her, I don't think I had $100 left.
Did you think that was going to be the end of your career then?
No.
When the war came on and that, or
No. We stored my stuff, and I hired a young doctor to take my practice, a Dr. Davis, who I got him in, he and his wife, and I gave him everything. He used to take everything, but take it till I got out of the war, or the Army. And this old doctor that I worked for was too old to go to the service, and he was on the procurement and assignment. And this doctor was a Dr. Jim Davis, and a very dishonest young man. He traded his gas stamps for I don't know what, and did everything basically dishonest, in conducting a business. And 3 times he had opportunities to leave, and I would call this old Dr. Clark, and he would notify this doctor if he left, he would be drafted. So then this Dr. Davis would stay on, and he stayed on to VJ Day. When VJ Day come, he pulled out and left everything. He never told me goodbye or go to hell or anything. And of course, I was still in service. But and this was without a veterinarian. Wabash was without a veterinarian until along in December, which about panicked me trying to get back and get myself established. But I finally got out of the service, and as I recall, the farmers here, the only person I recall was a Lawrence Heiner. They circulated petitions to get me back here. This was after the war was over, but I didn't have enough points to get out, even though I'd been in, it was almost 4 years then. I did get out and finally got back here along in December and started practice. And that was very difficult to try and make adjustment back to practice after you'd been out 4 years and start out in the dead of winter.
However, the practice was still here.
Yes, the practice was here, and this is, to be in a town this big is this is my idea of what a practice should be. I mean, in a town this large, and it was still here, and everything was fine.
You never heard of Dr. Davis again, huh? Let's tell some of the interesting stories of the ranch that you.
Well, of course, in telling the interesting stories about the ranch, these are just hodgepodge things, and I should really, as I recall when I talked to Rotary, I kind of visited like that. But one of the things, when you branded cattle, if you can imagine, we ate breakfast every morning at daylight. Just as soon as I could get the horses in, we would start out before sunup every morning, because when it started getting warm, the cattle bedded down and you couldn't find them, so you had to start early every morning. Well, from breakfast, then we would drive these cattle till 3 and 4 in the afternoon, and at the conclusion each day, we would end up with having we'd build a branding fire and brand and vaccinate all unbranded calves. That was one of our jobs we had to do. And of course, if you can imagine just a bunch of animals up on the range, one guy would rope, one guy would run brand, and one guy would try and hold these cows in a circle, which is just almost impossible. If the guy would walk into the middle of them roping, why, they'd run one way and run the other, and I was generally the kid, so I'd have to hold the cattle, in a circle so they could rope out the calves and brand them. Well, of course, they would castrate the bull calves, and the testicles. You talk about the Rocky Mountain oysters. Every day when we would finish branding, there would be 6 or 8 or maybe 10 sets of testicles for oysters, and we would take those and throw them right in the branding fire. and they would, of course, be on the coals, and they would cook till they'd pop open. When they'd pop open, we'd fish those out and knock the coals off of those and eat them. And of course, you'd be absolutely starved to death. And as I recall, the most wonderful things you ever ate. But I know my stepfather, when he looked and watched me eat those things, he said, "Oh, Nate," he said, "how can you eat those nasty things?" Just couldn't bear to watch it. Another thing on this ranch, water was always, any water that we had, we would put them in sumps. We'd take logs and make troughs out of it, and we'd take logs and put covers over the top of it so the animals couldn't dig that out and let the water collect, and it would run all the time. But the water on this range would maybe run 50 yards and go back in the ground. So in order to utilize this ground, we had to take care of the waters. And if anybody's ever been out west, you know you're thirsty almost all the time. And I recall it just laying on my stomach, sucking cow tracks dry, you know, just be enough collect in a cow track, and it might be a flop of cow manure 6 or 8 inches from your face, but you would suck these little cow tracks dry. You'd just be that thirsty. One time we were at the end of the range, right at the end of our range, and we went down in this valley, and none of us had ever been down in this valley before. We knew there's water there, and we had our pack horse with our beds, and we had decided to camp there all night. So we went down in there, and of course here was water, but it's rising out of gravel and running maybe 50 yards and going back right down into the gravel of the creek. It had probably maybe 10 miles down this canyon. Another spring might come out. But anyway, these animals, we had never worked on the water there and never done anything. And this water, these animals had been tromping and urinating, and fecal material was in this gravel and in this water till it actually was running green. And as I recall, it was just dusk then. We couldn't go another place. And we would dig down in the gravel alongside of this. And of course, the water would seep in there, but it'd seep in green. And it was so strong with cow manure, and there was no way. I know I tried to drink it, and you just couldn't make yourself swallow it. So you know what we did? We made it into coffee. Made it into coffee and drank it. Yeah, made it into coffee, and I got the taste of the coffee would cover up the taste of this cow manure. I remember a couple of weeks later, there was some steers stole on the edge of our range, and apparently they crossed our range, crossed the edge of our range and went down into a Larson. He stole 60 head of steers. But we went down in there. The cattlemen all went together and went with this guy that had lost his steers, and we went into his range. But I know when we were down in there, we drank water that came out of a vein of coal. And boy, I believe that was some of the worst. Boy, that was the worst tasting water I almost ever saw.
Did they have any superstitions or anything with the ranch hands? Or?
No, not as I recall. This was, no, I don't believe they're superstitious or anything like that. They were pretty tough guys. Which I look on now, our cowboys never went to town except at shipping time. They stayed out on this ranch an entire year, and these guys would save their money an entire year. As I recall, this colored man, now I don't know what his salary was, but once I remember my father said that Charlie received $100 a month, which was considered to be the top salary. In the depth of depression, we could hire cowboys for nothing, and tobacco, and clothes. Things were that bad and that depressed. But normally these guys would save their $30 a month. That was about $1 a day is what they were making. And they'd save that an entire year, and they would go to town. And these guys would be I would have slept with them. I'd stayed with them. They're my dearest friends. And my senior year, I was in Grand Junction, and these guys came in there, and when they got to town, they were the wildest, drinkingest, fightingest bunch of people you ever saw. And they would spend all their money. They would not leave. As if they had $5 left, you couldn't even remotely get them to leave town. These guys would go to the red light district in Grand Junction, and they would stay there. By George, they didn't get a room. They stayed. They bought this woman, as I recall, it was around $40 a night. And as I recall, I think the price of a prostitute was maybe $3 a go. And these guys would come, and I'd have a car, and I'd haul them around and go with them. I never fooled with any of the prostitutes, but they would kiddingly wave dollars over my head to the prostitutes, and I'd sit there in the living rooms, and these guys would go with them to the rooms, and there would generally be a madam that, I mean, they weren't, these gals were nice to me, and I was only maybe 16, 17, or 18 years old. But with my father dead, why, I would haul these guys around, and they'd buy bootleg booze. I remember one time a policeman stopped me, and I had a car full of those guys, and they had bought a gallon of whiskey, and all in pints, and had it on the floor of the back of the car. And these guys they were just my best friends. It seems unbelievable now. But this policeman stopped me, and of course I was scared. But he stopped to tell me that one of my headlights were out. And I turned and looked, and here was one of these cowboys with a bottle of whiskey going to hit him right between the eyes, just socko like this. Another time we were in one of these red light houses, and there was a boy next door with district. I recall this one time, one of the men I recall was Byron Smith, and Byron was married, and he wouldn't have anything to do with any of these prostitutes either, and the boys were going in and out with them, and by gosh, this Hap Thomason was in a house next door, and he came over, and he's a young boy. He maybe was older than I was, but he wasn't terribly large, and come over and said 2 salesmen had come in there and run him out. And boy, those guys went over next door, and those salesmen, I remember, they walked in there, and this Byron Smith, who was an awful tough man, he hauled off and hit this one salesman, and they, of course, knocked the other guy down and just literally beat the hell out of them. And I know every time they would try and get up, they'd get knocked down. And as last time I recall, those 2 salesmen, were dressed in overcoats, and really pretty nicely dressed fellas. And the one was bleeding quite badly from a badly cut eye. They were crawling down the front of the street in their hands and knees, and they didn't dare stand up or they'd have got knocked down. Years later, I ran into this Byron Smith, and he was running quarter horses out in Grand Junction. And this Hap Thomason had been killed or drowned, and he was telling about how tragic it was. This horse was such a bucker that this Hap Thomason, they were riding him across a pond. And, of course, they'd get this mean horse in the pond. He'd wear himself out swimming. And he said he ran up the house and got a camera. They were wanting to film it. This was years later when they apparently had movie cameras. And he was taking a moving picture of this mean horse going across this pond. And he said this horse reared up and went over backwards on this Thomason boy. And, of course, the Thomason boy couldn't swim. And before he could get back up to get his rope and throw it to this Thomason boy, he drowned, which is just real tragic because he was an absolutely delightful boy. I think of another story. These working these mules were always the honoriest things in the world to handle, pack mules. They could always carry twice as much as a horse. I always thought of this one mule, and we would make this pack trip between the 2 ranches, every week, and it was a terrible bore, and you'd pack horses, and you'd generally drive them, because to lead an animal while they were always pulling back, you wanted to go faster, and they'd pull back and make it difficult, so you'd drive them. And this one mule was packed with oats this one time, and coming down this mountainside into the canyon of Meadow Creek, he whirled and run around a mountainside, well, of course, it's all rocks and rims, and there's no way you can get up above them and turn them. So I had to follow him around, and this guy went till he couldn't go any farther. And then he started to turn around. He slid over one of these rims or cliffs, and down he went, end over end, completely out of sight. Maybe, I don't know, a number of 100 yards down below in a group of trees. Well, I knew he'd been killed, or I'd have to kill him. So I had to go clear back to the trail and go back down the trail and then cut back up to where this lousy mule was. Of course, I thought dying. And here that old mule was standing, hadn't been hurt at all, and he'd broken one of those sacks of oats and was standing there eating the oats, not hurt at all.
Fooled you.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah. What kind of horses did they have out there? What did you ride, and where did you get them, and so on?
Well, the horses, we raised our own horses. They are basically like wild horses. Mm-hmm. We did, the wild horses, actually were saddle horses that get away, mm-hmm. and they were almost impossible to catch. These saddle horses, you can't believe you couldn't drive wild horses or head them, but when you get to running wild horses, when you got in front of them, they'd run behind you. There's no way you could turn them. You could even, sometimes they'd ride and shoot guns up in the air trying to turn them. Mm-hmm. And you might be able to bend them a little bit, but they were extremely difficult to run and catch. At the time that I went to college, I must have had 20 or 30 mares. And, of course, the ranch basically would take the horses. I would occasionally get a horse to sell myself or trade. And but they had what they call quarter horse stock in them, and they were good animals. They were very good. They had to be ridden all day. But I've always thought you actually could ride a horse once every 6 days and just ride them to death. Mm-hmm. In the spring when they were so tough to buck, and of course in the spring these horses had been turned out all winter, and they'd buck and be mean and very spooky. And I remember if you got one that you had a hard time riding this one day, you just put your saddle back on him and rode him the next, and you rode him till
he got the message.
Yeah, he was tame enough, so he got on. He wasn't so cocky. And that was I always thought once we shipped horses or shipped cattle through the Ute Indian Reservation, and I know going through these Indian reservation to see the Indian horses. These Indian horses, they would trade, and of course they wanted splashy horses. They wanted pintos and things like that, and we took a wind-broke Palomino along that absolutely was worthless, and the Indians had almost never seen a Palomino then, and I know we traded this absolutely worthless horse for 3 good horses, mm-hmm. which in the Depression, that was very important to us. Mm-hmm. But the Indians, when they got a horse, of course, or when you on the ranch got a horse, you'd brand them. Well, the next guy that got them would put a vent. You just take a hot branding iron and go through the brand and put his own brand on. Well, these Indian horses would have 8 and 10. They would be branded all over on their neck and all over their rumps and all over their front quarters, because if they're really a good-looking horse, why, the Indians had traded them a number of times or lost them in card games and everything. Uh-huh. But
was it swift justice and relative to horse stealing that late or not?
Well, there was no horse stealing. There wasn't that.
Yeah.
Now, I know they told about my father catching an Indian with stolen horses. Mm-hmm. And they said he cut out maybe 20 or 30 horses, and the stolen horse wasn't even his. Mm-hmm. They really went after the Indians. I know my father once was telling about staying in Indian camp all night and eating with them the next morning. And as he left, he noticed the slab of meat they'd cut the breakfast steak from, and the only clean spot on this quarter of beef was where they'd cut this morning's steak off, and it was entirely covered with fly blows. And here these Indians, the flies in that country would blow anything, and I don't think there's anything that would upset anybody in that country worse than maggots or fly blows.
Yeah. Were the Indians much in evidence around?
Well, we were right against the Indian reservation, but they were there was one Indian that had a small cattle ranch that we went through once. But the Indians, absolutely, these were Utes, and they, as far as you could see an Indian, they were a lousy horseman. You hear what good horse people they were. They were the poorest horse people in the world. They just rode with no grace at all. You could just tell an Indian as far as you could see them. And they went for nothing. No, they went for every form of actually dissipation. They would a million times rather get in an old wagon and ride than a horseback and an old jalopy car. Why?
That was even better.
Yes. I spent one vacation with the Indian Commissioner's son in Fort Duquesne, and their opinion of Indians were about ours. I mean, these Utes they could drink, and when Indians drink, they absolutely just go right on. They drink to absolute oblivion. They don't get funny. They don't do anything. I think about the last time I left this town of Vernal, I saw a squaw drunk laying in a puddle of water, rolling around, too drunk to get up, and nobody, since she was so muddy, nobody would go near her, and she just laying there, rolling around, grinning, and
happy.
Yeah.
What did they ever have any medical problems or dental problems or that when you guys were out on the ranch, and what would happen and how would you handle them?
Well, of
broken
course,
bones and appendicitis.
Well, of course they'd have these things. I remember my little cousin that slipped and fell off, and a wagon run over his head and entirely scalped him. And they took him to town. It took him, to get to town was maybe 10 hours of good lucky driving. And they sewed this back on. I always remember this cousin of mine, he had a scar completely around his forehead and over his ear and back, and they got it sewed on pretty good. Of course, a rupture. That's really why when I needed a rupture operation, a rupture that would catch, you'd be in dire trouble. I mean, you'd die. That's all there was to it. And
how would they handle broken bones?
Well, they'd take them to town. They'd take them to town. They'd have suffered terribly, but they would. I remember we had a hired hand that this stacker I tell about, one of the springs broke and cracked him on the, as I recall, the hand, and we didn't think a lot. We thought he's an awful baby. And this guy laid and moaned all night long, and we finally realized that something was broken in his hand, and we took him to town, and he had a broken hand, and took care of it. I also recall this hired hand. It's a funny story and a true one. He irrigated, and his socks were always wet, and he'd put them in the oven at night. Well, this Negro, when he would be there, this would make him just so damn mad. He was so clean, and it just upset him terribly. So he would pick this guy's socks out, and he did this for about 2 or 3 mornings. The next morning, he got up and built a hell of a big fire and burnt them things. And when they really got smoking good, he went over and tapped this guy in bed and said, "I think your socks are done now."
That was their humor, huh?
Yeah.
Liquor out on the...
No liquor. No liquor. I do recall we brought back some bootleg when my mother's the other ranch, we came back with a gallon of bootleg liquor. And I know we stopped at this one cattle camp, and they never said a thing about liquor till we got on the horses to leave. And then they got out this gallon of whiskey and offered these guys a drink, and of course they followed us. They were going to chase wild horses, and I believe everybody heard they had liquor, and they came in for this gallon or two of bootleg liquor. It was an ether whiskey. I know that's the first time I ever tried to take a drink of whiskey, and it was out of a quart bottle, and it almost killed me. It was the worst smelling stuff I ever smelled, and even today, bootleg liquor smells like this awful, awful stuff. It's just awful.
Let's go back now and talk about how you met Amy and so forth, and then we'll come back. And as I say, we're going all over the place.
Amy and I did see, Amy and I went to the same college. I took summer school in 1 year to make up a half a semester in chemistry. When I'd started so late, and I had only gone a half a year in pre-vet, so I had half a year to make up, and I went and took chemistry. one summer to get caught up. And I saw Amy, but I never ever met her. And I always recall this friend that, this Ben Blood, we came back to Indiana, and I think the summer of 38, or in the Christmas of 38, I spent in LaFontaine with Ben, and we went back and we wormed a county of horses down around Springfield, Colorado. And anyway, we were back at a college dance, and I know Amy was there, and it was a tag dance. It was a great big dance in the gym. I said to him, well, I'm going to tag the gal I'm going to marry.
Uh-huh.
And he said, well, I'm going to marry this gal too. And he tagged his gal, and I tagged mine, and turned out that I did go ahead. I think Amy is the only gal I ever did want to marry, and I was lucky.
How long did you two go together then for?
I believe about 2 years.
2 years.
Mm-hmm. We didn't go together after that, but I remember Aim invited me to a Theta convention in Denver, and I went with two other fraternity brothers, and we went down and met these gals at the Brown Palace in Denver, and that's still an elegant hotel. Mm-hmm. And we went down there, but we had car trouble on the way down. Mm-hmm. So when we got there, the girls were at the convention, and we had absolute disaster. And I think our car cost us $16, and we maybe had $17 or $18 with us. And we got dressed and put our tuxes on in the men's restroom, and then I think we spent what little money left for some whiskey and had a drink or two of that. And I remember my wife was absolutely burnt because I couldn't pay for a meal or couldn't do something, I remember, and she never ever dreamed how poor I was. I know later when we were married, why, she said, I never saw such a bunch of rags for clothes that I'd been wearing. And it's kind of interesting, George. I batched my last year or two of college.
Mm-hmm. You didn't stay in the fraternity house then?
No, not my junior and senior year. I did maybe a year or two. Okay. But we batched, and our cost on batching, we could eat an entire meal on pork liver for 10 cents. I mean, 10 cents worth of pork liver. Mm-hmm. Our entire bill for a month on food came out to less than $5 per person. Mm-hmm. This don't seem possible now, but we'd buy buttermilk. We could get a gallon of buttermilk for just almost nothing. Mm-hmm. And we'd drink that instead of milk, and it was quite nutritious. And we'd eat, when things really got bad, we'd eat pork liver.
Mm-hmm. Pork liver.
Yeah, pork liver, which was terrible.
Yeah, where was Amy's home?
Well, Amy was from a very nice family and was about the largest home in town. I won't say Amy's family were the richest, but they were the old family of Fort Collins and lived in the house that occupied about a half a block. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, this house has been bought by the State Historical Society and is being refurbished as a historical home of Colorado and Fort Collins. But her family, best of my knowledge, never minded me or what I was going to do. Mm-hmm. Her brother her brother was betting on another guy, and mm-hmm. I finally got the stinker beat. But
what did her family do then?
Well, her parents were, they had laid out the town. I don't know, but they were the moneyed people that came out, and basically I think her grandfather laid the town out and started the bank, and her father had been in the bank. This town of Cripple Creek, I think he'd lost a small fortune in, and I think the family were very well-to-do. And the only thing was, I am sorry to say, I believe the mother left this family and Amy's family with the income and this money and property. They owned one of the blocks in the middle of town, but never would let this father get to all of it. And Mr. Avery was absolutely a delightful man. He never drank or anything. He was the authority on, he loved baseball and he loved banking, and he was, the best of my knowledge, was completely dignified, retired man. And this son said once that Dad loafed till he's 40 and then retired, and that's about what he did. He actually was an extremely dignified man, and I never took my wife as a girlfriend or as a wife, but what he didn't wait up at night till I brought her home. And
had her mother died?
No, she died before her father, but they both lived there. And of course, I married the baby, and they were very upset when she left. And I know the old father said, well, you know, Nate's real worried about leaving with no money for Indiana. He said, you know, if I was in his boots, I'd be worried too. Boy, I really was. Absolutely scared to death.
Then you were married in Fort Collins?
Yes. Married the day before I graduated. And I had one shocking thing. I'd been in an auto accident, and I was trying to get out of town without, I had a police fine of, I don't know, $5 to $10. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, I was going to graduate, and the police went up and stopped my graduation. I went to graduate and get my commission. So, all right. Well, when I went to graduate here, I was notified that I had to go and pay this fine before I could graduate. And I know that I didn't have very much money, but I had to pay, I don't know, between $5 and $10. And I was absolutely frightened when I wasn't going to get my diploma. I know that really scared me. Mm-hmm. And I went up and paid the police and went up to the administration building and showed them that I paid it. And then they released me to go ahead and graduate.
We were back on Charlie Glass. We were jumping around here.
Yes, well, as I look at this picture of this old guy, when he was apparently 56 to 58 years old, this old guy still would ride the bucking horses, the toughest ones in the outfit. I know I saw him riding I told you we traded for horses from the Indians. Well, one of the horses we traded was called, as I recall, Conejo. And I saw this horse buck down a mountainside with this old colored man on, and you can imagine jumping down a mountainside. They jumped tremendous distances, and he jumped in the top of a tree. And the old colored man climbed off, and the horse was still hung up in the top of the tree, and he climbed out and got down there. But now this one he was 58 years old. Uh-huh. I know I saw another time this horse was bucking, and this other V. Johnson, the other cowboy, he rode along behind him and whipped this horse. As he bucked, this old guy rode behind him and whipped him. Every time he could get close enough, he'd whip him with his rope to try and break him from bucking. Mm-hmm. But this old colored man, when I tried to be a cowboy bucking horse rider for a while, and I broke 3 or 4 horses. But he would have me take this horse out in where the rocks were the toughest in the stream bed and these boulders, and he said, get on your horse there. If he bucks, he won't buck half as hard because it hurts his feet. Mm-hmm. He never think of getting thrown off in there. And I remember when I broke these horses, we would get on and we'd rope them and tie one leg up. That would tie one leg. You'd put a rope around the neck and tie it around the hind leg. Then you'd put a saddle on there, and I'd get on those guys and rawhide them around this corral with a sack, trying to teach them to turn, and you'd have just a halter on there, and you'd pull them. And I did that on these 4 the first day, and then I did it on them a second day, and the third day this old guy would turn me out of the corral on these horses that didn't know how to lead or a thing. But horses normally will follow another horse, and he would go out ahead of me and let me follow him and ride along with me, and if they bucked, why they bucked, and then he'd turn and get them back in there. And I surely found out I wasn't going to be a bucking horse rider, even though I could ride 3 of them. A 4th horse could throw me any time he got ready to buck. He threw me. Mm-hmm. And finally, the old colored boy gave up on me. He decided I'd never be able to ride that horse. And I had another horse I could ride that could kick me any time he got ready to. And that I've never been kicked in practice like I got kicked by that horse. He absolutely chilled me.
Yeah. Were the harness makers in that part of the horse business? Were they important to the?
Well, of course, the people that made cowboy boots were known, and the saddles that they rode were that was the cowboys' world. Their boots and their saddles and their hats and things like that.
Talking about the saddles and anything unusual and.
Oh gosh, that's hard to say, George. There was a lot of different saddles. Now, they had a form-fitting saddle that when a cowboy would ride a bucking horse, he had big swells that were in front of his legs that he could kind of lock in and hold on to. And certain types of riders could ride with these swells. They called them form fitters, as I recall, or something like that, that they really would get their legs in under these big swells that came down from the horn and could hold and ride a bucking horse pretty well in those. Other types of people who would ride a bucking horse would ride it almost completely by balance. When they'd ride, you would hook your spurs in there. It seems spurs was a vital part to riding horses and making the animals do what you want. You spurred them. I don't mean you ever tore them up, but if you ever got bumped or hit, why, you'd hold on with your feet and the spurs, and when they bucked, why, you would hook the spurs into them or try and balance and grab them with the spurs when they were down.
How about the blacksmith? Did he play any part of it?
Well, we were our blacksmiths. We had our forges and we had our horseshoes, and this was a rocky country, so all horses were shod, and that was one absolutely horrible job, was shoeing these mean horses. Of the 40 or 50 horses we'll say we rode and had as pack horses and things, I think there was only 5 or 6 that you could walk up to on the right-hand side. They were used to being walked up to on the left-hand side, and you can imagine what it'd be to try and shoe these horses. And this was a rocky country, and you absolutely had to shoe them, and oh my Lord, I remember these mules, you'd end up with them just absolutely upside down with their legs tied to the top of fences and everything like that, and they'd hammer the shoes on them, and had to be done, absolutely had to be done. That's one of the funny parts. I just thought of it as the pack horses. I remember this colored man had this mule, and we had on all our canned goods and our bedding, and we're camping out, and just as he got to the top of this mountain, which is all brush, and we're tired, it's a long day, this pack saddle turned, and this mule started down this mountainside, kicking the pack and bucking, and he bucked right straight to the bottom and kicked everything off this, and here was all our clothes, all our cooking utensils, and our bedding and canned goods, and here we were crawling up and down there with our cowboy boots trying to pick up all these things and gather them in one place and put them back on this mule, I remember. And we cinched him up the next time. We almost cut him in two. When you cinch them up in the morning, you know, they'd be a lot bigger than they would be by afternoon. They'd dehydrate, and pack animal, when you start cinch them, or any horse, they'll swell up, you know, to try and keep the thing from being so tight on them. Another time I recall that my stepfather was driving this packing horse to the lower place, and he had it entirely filled with things. And this mule saw a herd of wild horses. They were grazing right along the path, and the mule run out there to go with the wild horses, because any horse is nutty about other horses, and wild horses, this mule had came from a bunch of wild horses, and so he run out there, my stepfather run out to head him, and his horse turned upside down on him and fell on him in the brush, and cracked one of the processes apparently on the lumbar vertebra of my stepfather. So a day later we found out that he'd been hurt, and we were to go out and try and find this mule, pack mule. Well, we got out there, and of course a pack mule, you know, it was only, there's nothing like a mule track. They're entirely different than a horse track. And we started tracking him, and as I recall, we saw where this horse of my father's fell on him, and there was only one print on the ground. It's just my stepfather's. This horse had rolled entirely on his body, right on and off, and just my stepfather there. But anyway, this mule had chased these wild horses, and of course they were just as afraid of a mule packed as they would be a ridered horse. And he had run them all that day, all that night, all the next day, and we followed him and would pick up pieces of the pack and pieces. When we finally found him, the only thing he had left was the pack saddle on him, the bridle or the halter, and everything was gone. I know I had a shotgun on there, and we found the barrel, and we found the stock, and oh, this horse and this mule was absolutely wild as a deer when we found him.
After running that long?
After running that long, he snorted and would run off. We finally headed him down a canyon and got him in. Another thing, when you would run onto these wild horses, when you're riding and you'd run onto these wild horses, the stallions would run. Do you think I'm holding this right?
That'd be okay right there.
All right, the stallions had a group of mares. They had a harem, just like apparently a sultan a harem. And they would have to take care of these mares. They said when a mare had a colt, they left the bunch and would have the colt, and he would have to go get them and run them back to the bunch. And when you were chasing wild horses, this stallion never would lead them as you would imagine. It would always be a wily old mare, and this stallion would run behind the bunch. And any mare that would be slow, he'd bite them, or any colt or anything. He'd handle them just like a sultan handled a harem. He also, when you would meet him on a range, a stallion, and they were absolutely beautiful, they would come charging up to maybe, maybe 200 or 300 yards away to check you out. And they'd come right up there and snort, and stallions can whistle, and they would whistle. This terrible snort would just sound like a whistle. And he would check you out, and when you found out you were riders and things like that, back he went and would start this bunch of mares running away. Another strange thing, a wild stallion would only use one place to go to the bathroom. And you'd get on a range and hear this stallion. If he'd been on there a number of years, he would have a pile of manure that would be 6 and 8 feet high. He would always go to this one place. Now I don't know that anybody ever tried to catch him at one place like that, and I won't say he wouldn't go to another place the pressure's on him, but you would find these tremendous mounds that the wild stallions had used.
Let's talk about brands. First of all, did they brand the mules?
Oh yes, they branded everything. They branded everything, and
what was your father's brand?
Well, my father's brand was a flying triangle. It was a V with a bar run clear across the top. This V and the bar extended out beyond the edges of the V, called a flying triangle. The brand he had, he traded ranches basically with this cousin, was called a Y cross, which would be a lazy Y, a Y laying down sideways with a cross on it, called a Y cross. My father got a bunch of purebred heifer once that he branded everything S on the shoulder. I don't know what. Each person had their own brand. I remember, and ear notches. They would, cut the half of the ear, the upper half, maybe the right ear. I know ours was the lower half of the right ear. And whenever a cow stick her head out of a bunch of brush or something, you knew whether it's yours or not. And I mean, some of the people, I remember I had a neighbor that used to cut a wattle out. He would cut on the brisket of the animal, that loose skin that hangs down. Why, he'd cut maybe a 6-inch, just slip his knife in there and jerk it down, and this wattle would hang, and you could see this wattle. Now I understood they had wattles on faces. They'd cut a wattle so it'd hang off the face, but that'd be more difficult.
Now, did they do this in addition to the brand?
Yes, every animal was ear notched. See, in the wintertime, when their hair's real heavy, you can't see a brand. But the minute you can see that face, why, then you know whether that was your animal or not. Now, of course, horses were generally not horses you'd put a small brand on, at least we would. The Indians have these crazy brands all over the horse, and you could always tell an Indian horse.
What was when did you brand, and what would that take? What was that like?
Well, of course, branding horses that's quite an operation and very difficult. And castration of horses, this took ability. Mm-hmm. You can't just castrate them. I know this one foreman thought he was really smart and went out and castrated, I don't know, 6 or 7 horses, and I think 3/4 of them died. They would bleed to death and things like that. And of course, you always castrated horses at an older age. But each spring, the newborn calves were branded, and ear notched, vaccinated for blackleg, and castrated as you gathered them. You did that the entire summer long. Whenever you had an unbranded calf, well, you'd brand them. Mm-hmm. And I can't for the life of me recall. I had my own brand, and when I went to college, they sold those animals, and we put it, I don't know, maybe it came to $500 at that time, but I had that to go to school one year.
Mm-hmm. Who was doing the veterinary work for your herds and that? Did they?
Well, no, there was just none. Yeah. I remember my parents drove up, or this foreman drove, I think, 20 head of cows with lumpy jaw up a canyon, shot the whole lousy outfit. Mm-hmm. Can't believe it. Because at that time there was a treatment. This Dr. Ferguson I went to had a treatment of sodium iodide, and you could treat them, and we could have taken them to town and, and pastured them out and treated them and sold them and made money. But yeah. Never, I never ever, during the Depression, I think one of the men that came out and appraised animals was a veterinarian. Mm-hmm. That's the only veterinarian. This was, if you can imagine, I know at night, sometimes on the top of this mountain, I could look and see Grand Junction 100 miles away. You could see the lights of this town 100 miles and from the top of this range. But it was a long, long ways there.
Yeah. But you had no advice or help. It was just all intuition and knowledge passed on from one to the other.
Yes, well, yes. I remember the Cowboys treatment was, actually, it was apparently a long time back. Of course, this was 40 to 50 years ago, but they would cut the animal's tail. Mm-hmm. They'd always say, well, the animal's poisoned, and they would run up and grab a cow's tail and cut it a couple of times with a knife. It must have been a carryover from bloodletting of the old time, because that's, I know once we lost a number of animals up on our range that it must have been a poisoning, and I know at that time I got off and got a pocket knife and cut this cow open from stem to stern. Uh-huh. I know this other old cowboy said, I've seen a lot of people that do that, but I never seen one that knew a damn thing about it when he got done. And the more I recall, that was just right. I didn't know a darn thing. Yeah.
Did you find that was a tremendous influence on your life? Has it changed your outlook? I mean, made you more conservative, or?
Oh, it's hard to know. I think the Depression, I don't know that you went through it, and I guess we did visit at lunch, that I think the influence of the Depression has influenced my life. Mm-hmm. You still are scared to have things happen to you that happened to you in during your youth. I know I heard this man tell about making $20 a day in the First World War. Mm-hmm. And I was pretty young, and I thought that has to be a lie. That has to be a lie, because I don't believe anybody could make $20 in a day. But I thought in my mind, if I ever do, I will save $18 of that. It don't seem possible.
Yeah. We're going to talk about the kids a little bit. I think we haven't exhausted everything. We're going to talk about the children. All right. And let's talk about how they came along and what you were doing and what your thoughts were at that time. And for the first one born was?
Well, the first one born was Diane, and I purchased the business in Wabash, and we came down here, and I came here the 7th of December, which is Pearl Harbor. And Amy was about 8 months pregnant then. And Amy was born in or Diane was born in, when was it?
Well, we can find that.
Well, I don't know, but Diane was born, I believe, in February. I'm embarrassed about that, but anyway, I know the veterinarian at Rowan, his wife had had a cesarean just a month before, and we visited her in the hospital, and Amy could hardly get in the door then, and this sweet gal that was married to Dr. Dersham died of the blood clot the next day after we visited her, which is extremely sad, and it's quite shocking to us that anything like that could happen. When Diane did arrive, we did have an old semi-nurse, a trained lady, to come and stay with her. This was an extremely terrible time for us. Diane had a terrible diarrhea, and we had a doctor that did not communicate very well. So I recall one day I came home, and here Diane was crying, and my wife was crying, and this old lady was sitting there crying with them too. We thought we were going to lose her, and we feel if we hadn't changed doctors, we would have lost her. But we didn't. Of course, we had no parents and no friends. I know a couple stopped in from Columbia City to visit us, and here we didn't know enough to burn a big enough hole in the nipple for to nurse the baby, and they showed us how to burn a hole, in the nipple to nurse Diane. Of course, I left for the service just almost a year around. I left, I don't know, the first week or so in December, and Craig was born in September of that year. I know we had a terrible time naming Craig, and I never knew what his name was going to be because I was in the service and Amy was in Colorado, and she'd write a list of names, and then I'd write a list of names, and really people that have been raised far apart, it's extremely difficult to agree on a name because the names you think are great, they associate with a person they didn't care for. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I got a telegram that Craig had been born, and I guess it almost killed my stepfather, Amy's father. He'd been used to a wife that would go down and have a baby in about 30 minutes, and I think Amy was in 18-hour labor, and he stuck it out with her, but he'd stay for a while, and then he'd go down and visit with this old doctor crony of his to see whether everything was going according to Hoyle. But this actually, even though we were separated, Amy's parents got acquainted with our children, and she was there for a year or two. And I didn't see Craig, I don't think, till he was 7 or 8 months old. I couldn't get a way to go out there. And of course, you have to take a train then, and it took quite a bit of time. But Amy's mother was very, very fond of Craig, and of course his father-in-law, Mr. Avery, had never experienced a dog in his house, or this little Diane. He said, that little girl has fed that dog 1,000,000 crackers, and which is about right. And then, of course, we stayed in Army camps. I know we moved on maybe an average every 3 months. The first few years of our life in the service, we moved every. Poor old Aim stayed in rooms, and some lady that left and turned the heat out on us, and we had some bad experiences in the service, and yet we had some delightful landlords. In Toma, I remember they both stood up and cried when we left, which is something for a landlord.
Yeah, for a landlord to cry.
Linda, of course, came after we were back here in practice, and when you can afford a child and babysitters and everything like that, even though Linda was a cesarean, she was coming backwards. It was never the strain handling or taking care of Linda that the other children had been. Mm-hmm. Can't think of what else to say here, George.
I think talk about your grandchildren and what a delight the family have been.
Well, of course.
I shouldn't be putting words in your mouth.
Well, of course, that is true. Even though I guess I took the kids on trips and did as much. We went camping and things like that, but it never seemed that I ever enjoyed or had the fun or least relaxed enough to enjoy the children like I do the grandchildren. They're an extreme pleasure. Of course, we're not getting them hanging out our ears, but I do think this is the most enjoyable time of life by far, that Amy and I are spending 2 months a year traveling, and our children are extreme pleasure. We have as much fun with them as we would with you and your wife. All of them but one play bridge, so we hang right in, and a bridge game never quits.
You know, I think that we'll make some copies and send this to the children for Christmas. What would you say to the kids at December 25th or so?
Well, it's hard to say, but I pray that they can spend as many years with their wife. And Merry Christmas to all of you. There you go. Well,